This video is in response to Redeemed Zoomer's video on denominational closeness. Now, I have to begin by saying I have a lot of respect for Redeemed Zoomer, despite the fact that people might jokingly say that he infamously described John Calvin's views on the terminology of Christology as Nestorian. That's a little inside joke for people there. But Redeemed Doomer does a lot of good things. I think his promotion of thinking in terms of denominations and actually caring about the theology that denominations have is pretty good, as well as his effort to reform the theology of denominations that have been damaged by modernist and liberal theology. That is also very good. So I have a lot of respect for that. So I just want to say that this is out of a focus for accuracy and for careful study. Now, that being said, I think that there are some worthy criticisms of Redeemed Zoomer's positions in regards to how he decides to determine the relationship of various denominations as well as their theological closeness. And I won't be making a direct criticism of the exact decisions that he made here, but I will be offering an alternative view that I think will help people understand through a comparison with what he said, where I think he has made perhaps a few mistakes or a few oversights in his studies. Nevertheless, I do still have quite a fondness for people making denominational charts. I've made several myself in the past, both looking into the relationship of denominations as well as the historical origin of denominations. And I've looked into a lot of church history, and I've read and studied quite a bit about the topic. Now, anyway, let me introduce myself. I am C.A. Brill, known online as Anavultus. I have published and written 4 books, one on the ontology of justice, one on conservative political theory, as well as 2 opposing certain recent trends in Christian political philosophy. So, or political theology, perhaps is a better way to look into that. So I have written and published 4 books, and I have also made many videos on various topics in the past. So I'm not just some guy that's coming out of nowhere with this. The things I do and say are respected by the church that I'm a part of. I write with the approval of my elders, not with the subscription of them, because I'm sure people have different positions, but with the approval of my elders. That's not to say that everything I say is necessarily in line with what the church that I'm a part of would want to publicly affirm. Not that I'm a controversial guy in any sense. I just want to hedge that so that people don't attribute the things I say to other people. Nevertheless, I think it is important to emphasize the usefulness of denominational charts. Having a visual representation of the relationship between different things is very useful in our understanding of how they are related, as well as how we look at how things are related as well. So taxonomy is an important field of study and practice that helps us understand very many things about what we are analyzing. So before we get into this chart that I've made here, I'd like to talk a little bit about the philosophy of denominational taxonomy. So I think one thing that's very important is a focus on formal and material principles. What do I mean by that? Well, formal and material principles are a way of understanding denominations based on their formal principles. That is to say, the things that form what they believe, you could say the sources of their beliefs, and the material principles, which are the content of their beliefs. So, for example, in the case of the Catholic Church, the official Catholic position is that the Catholic Church has three main uh, things upon which its doctrines are based. One is Holy Scripture, the other is sacred tradition, and the third is the magisterium of the Church, which is just a way to say how the church does things through its positions of authority. So this could be papal decrees, church councils, and various other things, decisions that are being made actively in the church. And that in some ways combines with tradition. Now, obviously, from an evangelical perspective, there are very many criticisms that can be made on that, on those things. But I just want to emphasize that that is their formal principles, and that the material principles of their faith and worship are therefore then derived from those formal principles. Or another case would be Adventists. Adventists have scripture as a formal principle, but they also have a focus on the teachings of Ellen White and a few other people to a lesser extent that informs what they believe. Or many Baptists have a position of sola scriptura, so they believe that tradition is something that is something that could, in some cases, be useful, but it is more something that's discretionary and prudential rather than something that is formative to their beliefs. So that is something to look at. Another important thing to look at is the broad traditional groupings of denominations. You could say that denominations can fall into a number of different groupings based on common traditions. You can perhaps look at it in the sense of these people look at the teachings of the same theologians, or they are very interconnected in terms of the theologians that they read and discuss. That's one way to look at the commonness of traditions, but also that they believe the same things about many different things. So therefore, there are broad groupings of traditions. For example, you could say that there is a evangelical reformed tradition that includes multiple denominations that believe very similar things on certain issues. And there's an evangelical Lutheran tradition as well. So those are things to look into. Another one is being in communion with each other. The closeness of denominations can be determined by who they are actively in communion with. So there's obviously some types of communion that are interdenominational, where there are some substantial differences in beliefs, but that they are still in communion with. For example, you see this in the mainline churches in North America, where they are generally in full communion with each other, although there are a few exceptions depending on what you consider mainline. But they also come from different theological traditions. However, there are many communions that consist of churches that are in the same tradition, or that are in traditions that believe similar things. So there's a wide Reformed communion that contains various Continental Reformed and Presbyterian and Congregationalist, in some cases, churches. There's also the World Anglican Communion. There's also other interdenominational communions that are inclusive of certain denominations and exclusive of others, like the Porvo Communion, the Union of Utrecht, and other groups like that that have certain beliefs uh, in common with each other that they don't necessarily have in common with others. Now, another thing to look at is the historical origin of denominations. Frequently, denominations will have things in common with denominations that they have a historical relationship to. However, in some cases, this is not the case. For example, the Stone Campbell movement, both Stone and Campbell started out as Presbyterian ministers, but nowadays the descendants of their movement are in many cases openly anti-reformed in their soteriology. So that is a case of a movement coming out of one tradition but aligning more with a different tradition later on. But in other cases, for example, the Congregationalists believe things that are very similar to the Presbyterians because they both have a historical relationship with the Brownists and the Puritans and the Dissenters that were very reformed in their theology. Another thing to look at is that a lot of denominational charts will not look at every facet of theology because to look at every facet of theology, you need to have a multi-dimensionality in your analysis of denominations. So perhaps a way to do that would be rather than having a visual clustering that is two-dimensional, you might have a three-dimensional clustering system. Another thing to do is to perhaps have several different axes of gradients and place denominations on those gradients in terms of their different theological positions. So you could have different vertical rows all showing different positions in relation to certain positions. And you see this in multi-axis political tests online, for example. So those are all things to consider. So I want to emphasize that this chart is not meant to be exhaustive in its clustering of different traditions. And I will also say that in many cases, the clustering of these traditions wraps around to other positions that are perhaps a bit more distant or closer to each other in certain ways. And that there's also the potential for denominations to have eclectic positions, that is to say, deriving them from multiple traditions or having them in common with multiple traditions, meaning that they don't really smoothly fit in one specific position in relation to other denominations on the chart. That being said, let's actually take a look at this chart that I made. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And this chart is not meant to be highly accurate. However, it is meant to focus on a few things that I believe Resume Zoomer missed out on a little bit. Some things that I think are important. Now, you may notice that I have generally divided evangelical churches into 5 broad groups that all have some degree of overlap, because there are, of course, denominations that take influence from multiple groups. So you have evangelical, reformed, and adjacent churches. That is to say, there are churches which everybody agrees are evangelical reformed. And by the way, people wondering, why do I put evangelical in front of reformed or in front of Lutheran? Because that is what the reformers called themselves. They called themselves evangelicals. They generally did not call themselves Protestants so much, except for in the political context of the protestation at Speyer, which is a different a specific event. So anyway, I don't like calling them Protestants because of that. I think it's more historically accurate to use the word evangelical. However, I do understand that in the context of American denominational studies, it might be a bit confusing to some people. So I want to emphasize that evangelical does not mean evangelical uh, as opposed to fundamentalist, modernist, or mainline. It just refers to the historical self identification of groups emerging from the Reformation. So, evangelical, reformed, and adjacent churches. The reason I put adjacent is because these are churches that some might not say are reformed, but if you had to place them close to other groups, they would align much more with the Reformed than anyone else. Evangelical, Lutheran, and adjacent churches. Uh, Similar idea. Arminian, Wesleyan, and adjacent churches. Charismatic and adjacent churches. Historical, Anabaptist, and adjacent churches. So those are the five main groupings. Now you could make more, and I wouldn't begrudge people for making more because I will say that there are some in here that do not smoothly fit onto these, but these describe most of the evangelical groupings. And then at the bottom here, I've got non-evangelical groups as well. And you could say that all of these could be smaller circles, and I could just put them in relation to these others. But this is essentially just a zoomed in thing, and that's one way to look at it. Now, anyway, I'll begin here on the left side, and evangelical reformed obviously includes the continental reformed churches. It also includes the Presbyterians. I think that's pretty much agreed everywhere. And I will also say that there are Calvinistic Methodists. And what do I mean by that? Well, when the Methodist movement began, it was not actually a movement that was united by specific theological positions, but rather by the method of study that was used by the founders of the movement, and so their relationship as well as people that had studied these things together. So the Calvinistic Methodists generally originate from early Methodists like George Whitefield, uh, and they eventually became folded into the Presbyterian movement. So, for example, the Presbyterian Church of Wales is a Calvinistic Methodist church, whereas most Methodists that are still called Methodists nowadays are Wesleyan, so they hold a different position on that. The Church of England is a bit complex because of a number of compromises that were made. Uh, and I think an important thing to emphasize here is the historical meaning of high church versus low church. High church and low church don't mean complexity versus simplicity. They don't mean being ornate versus unadorned. They mean something very specific in relation to Reformed theology and the traditionalist positions of the Church of England. Because when the Church of England was reforming, there were many people who began leaning towards a position that nowadays is called the regulative principle of worship. That is to say, they wanted to say that you should only worship God in ways that are explicitly uh, allowed in Scripture, as opposed to allowing for the accretion of various traditions. So, a major controversy in the Church of England in the 16th century, for example, was priestly vestments, whether or not a priest in the Church of England ought to wear specific clothes that was traditional, or should just wear contemporary clothing that was uh, modest for the occasion. So that was one thing. Another high church versus low church issue would be just Reformed theology in general. Reformed theology was associated with the low church, whereas the high church was associated with maintaining a more traditional and slightly less reformed aspect. I will say, however, another thing is that the historical high church is not necessarily Anglo-Catholic, although it is somewhat adjacent to the position of Anglo-Catholics. So you could be high church in the Church of England without wanting to uh, re-enter communion with the Pope. And that's the main difference between high church Anglicans and Anglo-Catholics. Anglo-Catholics believe that the Reformation was largely a mistake, and that the Church of England should re-enter communion with the Catholic Church. Although, in the context of saying that the Reformation is a mistake, I should clarify that it does not necessarily mean that they believe that all things about the Reformation were unwarranted, but rather that the splitting of the church is something that should be reversed, and that they are willing to submit to Catholic positions and theological developments that have occurred since the Reformation. Whereas there are other high church Anglicans who are not willing to do that. And then there's central church Anglicans who hold a sort of middle position on that. So another high church, low church issue would be this is a more extreme case, but exclusive psalmody, that is to say, only singing the psalms from the book of Psalms as opposed to allowing for hymns. So that would be a low church position. But it's also a position held by some Presbyterians. So what I'm trying to say here is that low church does not necessarily mean unadorned. It does not mean having a simple worship style, historically speaking. Low church simply means essentially looking through a lens of the regulative principle of worship, as opposed to maintaining traditions that have accrued through the Middle Ages. However, low church also lends itself to that unadorned style. So I will not deny that. I will not deny that. But that is generally the historical position here. Now, another important thing to look at is the Lutherans. Lutherans are generally in close communion with the remaining Hussite groups that exist. But there's also a merger that occurred in mainly the 19th century between Lutheran and Continental Reformed churches, a forced political merger that led to the development of union churches that have both theological traditions within them. Now, going back to the insular Reformation, the Reformation in England and Scotland, you have the Presbyterians, but as England developed its Anglican position in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, there were groups of people in the church that could not, for whatever reason, remain in communion, in full communion with the Church of England, either because they were rejected by the church for holding various theological positions, or because they themselves simply refused to be. And those were dissenters of the church. And a main group of that is the Brownists, who are very important in Puritanism. But a lot of these dissenters developed independent churches, that is to say, churches that were independent of the Church of England. leading to the development of Congregationalism, which was generally reformed in its theological bent. But some of these dissenters also developed a Baptismic theology. So this is where I'm going to start talking about Baptists. And I think a general misunderstanding that people have about Baptists is the idea that Baptists are a single theological tradition. But what I hope to show here is that Baptistic theology, that is to say, credo baptism, is something that can develop in multiple theological traditions, and that people who hold baptismic theology from those multiple theological traditions in many ways can have more in common with the tradition that they originate from than the tradition that they developed into through accepting credo baptism. So I will say generally the upper part here and a lot of the more right-hand side hold Baptistic positions. And in terms of total people holding Baptistic positions, of people who would publicly identify themselves as Christians, there are, if you include people who believe credo baptism who aren't Baptists, as there are very many of them, there are perhaps 400 million, perhaps more or less, depending on how you categorize them. And only a quarter of them are Baptists, are historical Baptists, as there are in fact very many of them who are not historically Baptist and actually come from positions other than both historical Baptists and historical Anabaptists. So I think that that's something to mention here. Now, why are Reformed Baptists adjacent to Reformed theology? Reformed Baptists, also called particular Baptists. I know that Redeemed Zoomer doesn't like calling them Reformed Baptists, but that is what they call themselves. If we want to object to them being called Reformed Baptists, then we should also object to other churches calling themselves Orthodox or Catholic or Presbyterian or whatever, or holy or pious or whatever, all those different things. If we're going to object to that based on that, then we can object to all sorts of other things. But let me just give a brief case as to why Reformed Baptists belong more closely to other things that are called Reformed than to other groups that are called Baptist. The reason for that is that, number one, they have historical roots with Reformed churches. Namely, they come out of the Brownist movement of dissenters that were generally Reformed theologically. So they have they have a historical heritage that they have in common with other English Puritans, like the Congregationalist and English Presbyterians, who are different than the Scottish Presbyterians, which I think is important to mention here. Another reason is that they actively sought to enter in communion with Reformed churches, although they were rejected. And not just that, there were some Westminster divines who actually thought that independent churches of Baptist theology should be included in the new Church of England that they were organizing at the Westminster Assembly, that the Westminster Confession of Faith should be friendly to Baptists and should be amenable to their position to allow them to be in full communion with the Presbyterians and Congregationalists. But that was a minority position in the assembly, and it was rejected, even though some of the people that held this position were some very prominent members of the assembly. So It's not something that is historically unusual in that sense. Another element here is the CREC, which many people consider a Presbyterian denomination or just a generally Reformed denomination, also allows for Baptists to be members of them. So they are in communion with Baptists. The Presbyterian Church of Ulster allows member congregations to allow for credo baptism. So, so there is a historical trend of Baptists wanting to be in communion with Reformed churches, and some Reformed churches allowing them, and others forbidding them. Another element here is the historical Baptist confessions. Famously, the most commonly used Reformed Baptist confession, the Second London Baptist Confession, is largely based on the Westminster Confession of Faith, as well as the Savoy Declaration used by Congregationalists, which is also based on the Westminster Confession of Faith. So that's another element of why they agree more with that tradition than they do with other traditions. Another thing I think is important to mention is that if you talk to Reformed Baptists, you will find that they very frequently read, discuss, study, quote Reformed theologians, John Calvin, Theodore Beza, people like Jonathan Edwards. Those are all names on the lips of Reformed Baptists. And even more recent figures like R.C. Sproul and what's his name? Sinclair Ferguson. Those are people who a lot of Baptists hold in high esteem, and they use the writings of Reformed theologians to inform their theology. It's just that there are three main areas where there are differences between Reformed Baptists and the traditional Reformed denominations. And one is church polity, although that is something that isn't that different when you consider Congregationalists. The second is baptism, of course. And the third, related to baptism, is the type of covenant theology that they have, because they historically used a type called Westminster federalism, but there are sorry, not Westminster federalism, 1689 federalism, named after the year in which the confession was ratified, which is a sort of modified form of Westminster federalism, which is used by a lot of Presbyterians as a form of covenant theology. So I think that this is a major mistake Redeemed Zoomer makes a lot, sort of pigeonholing Baptists as one group instead of separating them into different traditions, which because they are separated in reality. Although in places like the Southern Baptist Convention, there are actually General Baptists and Reformed Baptists in full communion with each other. But so that is something that does exist in that case. And I will also make a distinction between Reformed Baptists and Calvinistic Baptists. People like John MacArthur, who does not hold to who's not confessional and therefore does not count as a Reformed Baptist by the historical standards of Reformed Baptists. So he is not really an exemplar of the Reformed Baptist tradition, I would argue. Now, going into the Evangelical Lutheran side and adjacent churches, there is actually a lot in common between the way Lutherans and many Anglicans work in their churches. There's also something in common between Old Catholics and Jansenists and groups that split off from the Catholic Church. There's the Union of Utrecht. There's the Porvo Communion, and a lot of these groups are actually in communion with each other. In a closer way than they are in communion with Reformed or Wesleyan Arminian groups. Now, I will also mention radical pietists. Radical pietists come from the historical pietist movement in the Lutheran Church, and they essentially split from the Lutherans. And there are actually many radical pietists who developed credo baptism. So the examples of radical pietists would be the Evangelical Free Church, and also Converge, which is the denomination John Piper belongs to. So it's interesting that there's a different tradition that developed a Baptistic theology. Now, the Thre-Self patriotic movement, I placed it over here, although it's a bit hard to argue exactly where it is because it's not really something that belongs to a specific tradition, but it for people who don't know what it is, it's essentially the legally sanctioned evangelical church in China, and it and essentially congregations have to submit to government censorship, as opposed to Chinese house churches, which illegally gather and do not submit to censorship. So, but they do have some things in common with each other. And a lot of people, when they discuss the Thre-Self patriotic movement, discuss it in terms of either the three selves that they have, which is their anti-colonialist position and anti-imperialist position, which they have to have in order to sort of separate themselves from churches outside of China because of the communist revolution being hostile to historical ties with European churches. And the other thing that is frequently discussed is its commitment to censorship. But I think there are a few things that can be definitively said about it. Number one, it is sort of a denominationally neutral in terms of the traditions that are held in the church, because it's a merger of different churches that existed in China before the Communist Revolution. Those are, for example, the Anglicans, the Congregationalists, and the Baptists. And the general polity of the Thre-Self patriotic movement churches is Congregationalist. And they also have, as far as I'm aware, from the official information that I could find, they affirm on an official website that they focus on credo baptism. So they are Baptistic in their views on that. But other than that, I could say that they could belong anywhere in this area, although I don't think that there's many charismatic people in the Thre-Self patriotic movement, as far as I know. Anyway. Another thing to look at the bottom here, Anglo-Catholics, of course, are still in communion with the Church of England. So these aren't, when I say Anglo-Catholics, I don't mean English Catholics. That is to say, Englishmen who are in the Catholic Church. I mean people who are in the Church of England who want the Church of England to merge with the Catholic Church, or to reunite with the Catholic Church as they would view it. So I think that is something to emphasize, that there is a distinction to be made there. But Catholics and Eastern Catholics are in full communion with each other. The Eastern Catholics are particular churches that are considered part of the Catholic Church, but are not part of the Latin Church, which is a church within the Catholic Church that itself is composed of particular churches ruled over by bishops. But I'm not going to talk about the whole structure of these churches. But Eastern Catholics are groups that come from other traditions that divided from each other in the ancient and medieval period. So there's the Orthodox churches, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church. I put them in parentheses because it's kind of rude to call them Eastern or Oriental, depending on who you talk to. They want to be the Orthodox Church, but we need to distinguish them from each other because their theology is radically different. And of course, the Church of the East, which people call Nestorian. But as everyone knows, Redeemed Zoomer doesn't really know what Nestorian is. But that's a joke, by the way. I'm not trying to rag on Redeemed Zoomer too much. He's a nice guy. Next, historical Anabaptist and adjacent churches. You've got the Mennonites and the Amish. There's also Hutterites. They're small enough that I decided not to include them. There's a lot of small groups that I decided not to include. Plymouth Brethren, for example. And there's the Schwarzenau Brethren, who are related to the Radical Pietists, but also to the Mennonites. So they sort of had influence from both groups, but they typically, if they enter in communion with other denominations, it's the Mennonites and not with Lutherans. So I put them up here. Now, once again, I like to emphasize that the closeness of these things don't necessarily mean that they are close to each other. It's more trying to categorize them in relation to the broad theological tradition that they are in. Now, another look here is the Arminian and Wesleyan and adjacent churches. Now, the proper name for churches that are aligned with Arminius and other people like that is the Remonstrants. But they also have a lot of influence on Wesleyanism, which is the main Methodist grouping. And of course, the holiness churches developed from the Wesleyan Methodist movement. Now, the Wesleyans were originally in full communion with the Anglicans before they were eventually ejected. Now, related to the holiness churches is the Higher Life movement, or Keswickian, or is it Keswick? They had a lot of influence on the development of Pentecostals, although they are themselves not Pentecostal. Then I'd like to look at the General Baptists. The General Baptists have a soteriology that is typically similar to Arminianism, but they're not exactly Arminians. They're not exactly Wesleyans. I'd like to also include people like Provisionist Baptists, who do not hold the historical Baptist position, I'd like to emphasize. Sorry, Leighton Flowers, that's just how it is. But I think a big difference between some Baptists and Wesleyans and Arminians is that there are a lot of Baptists who don't believe in prevenient grace, which is a position that Lutherans and Arminians believe in. They believe that even if saving faith is something that you need to actively participate in, it has to follow first a prevenient grace, a grace that comes before being able to have faith. Now, there are many Baptists who believe in prevenient grace, but there are many General Baptists who do not, and who hold to a position that some people call easy believism, although that is a bit of a derogatory term. The Restoration movement, or the Stone Campbell movement, has a soteriology that is more similar to the Arminian and Wesleyan position. Now, in terms of the sacramentology of Baptists, in terms of the Lord's Supper, I will emphasize that there are very many Reformed Baptists who hold positions that are historically Reformed, whether that is the position of Zwingli, who is part of the Reformed tradition, the position of Calvin, and there's also the position of the Consensus Tigerinus, which is meant to unite the two camps. So there are many Reformed Baptists who would have no problems affirming the Consensus Tigerinus. General Baptists, on the other hand, tend to have what people call the memorialist view, because even Zwingli believed in a real presence, although he defined it quite differently than how others define it. But there are also General Baptists, I believe, who do believe in a real presence, though typically not in the same sense as historically Reformed churches would. Now, typical non-denominational churches fall generally in between Pentecostals and Baptists, in that there are a lot of non-denominational churches that are Pentecostal, and there are some that are Baptist. And I think a general caricature people make is that all non-denominationals are Baptists. Now, they all hold typically to a Credo Baptist position, but I think it's worth noting that there are very many large non-denominational organizations. If you have a big organization, can you really be non-denominational? That's just a side point. Who are mostly Pentecostal. So I would typically think non-denominational aligns a lot more with the Pentecostal position than it does with the Baptist position, because if Baptists separate from a denominational group, they just become independent Baptists rather than non-denominational, or at least that's historically how it worked. Now, there are many Baptists who are not charismatic who are non-denominational today. So, but I think it's worth noting that it is a misleading stereotype to assume that non-denominationals have more in common with General Baptists than they do with Pentecostals. I think it's better to look at them on an individual basis. And there are also a lot of non-denominationalists who are in the higher life movement. Okay, another thing to look at here is charismatic and adjacent churches. When I look at this grouping, what distinguishes it from other groupings is because you can be charismatic and be Reformed. There are groups like that that are continuationist Reformed churches. So you could say that these all wrap around to each other in some way. But what distinguishes people who are solidly charismatic from people who are not is that they believe that charismatic gifts are not only things that can exist in the church, but are normative to the church as it exists today, or that if they're not normative to the activity of a church, there is perhaps a recent past that is not in an apostolic age, but more recently, in which charismatic gifts align with the formal principles of a church. That is to say, new revelation in recent years. This is something believed by many Adventists, which is why Adventists are sort of charismatic, but they're also closely related to Baptists as well. But they're with the restoration movement as one of the types of restorations that people make. But Pentecostals, a lot of Pentecostals believe that you need that you need to be spiritually baptized as a separate thing from water baptism that is not identical with regeneration. uh, but that generally occurs in the manifestation of charismatic gifts. Now, not all Pentecostals believe this, but that is something that there are Pentecostals who believe. There's a new apostolic Reformation movement which arose from the Pentecostals. Uh, and I should say that should not be confused with the Irvingians or the Irvingites. The Catholic Apostolic Church and the New Apostolic Church, which is not the same thing as the New Apostolic Reformation, and also not the same thing as another thing called the New Apostolic Church, which originates from the Catholics. Um, I would say, from what I understand about Irvingian theology, it's eclectic. It originated from Presbyterianism, but has a very high sacramentology, similar to the Catholics. Um, and historically had some charismatic tendencies, to the point that some people consider them to be somewhat predecessors of the modern charismatic movement. Although I don't know if they were influential enough to be considered that. Um, but they are very controversial, just as the Adventists are controversial as to whether they should even be included in charts like this, um, because they hold a number of positions that are controversial, such as the Irvingians have in common with the New Apostolic Reformation that they believe in modern day apostles who hold similar authority to the first century apostles. And that is a controversial position. Another controversial positions held by the Irvingians is the way that they understand their sacraments, and that sacraments and ordinations can only derive from people who have been appointed by the apostles that they have, to the exclusion of other apostles, meaning that the sacraments of other denominations aren't valid in many ways, or that they are defective in some cases. But there are, of course, uh, some similarities between that and Catholic and Orthodox perspectives, in certain ways. I'm not going to say that they're identical on this issue, because they are not. So, in that perspective, it's in my opinion not as off the wall as some people think it is, because it's not extreme if you include Catholics and Orthodox churches, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Nestorian Orthodox. But I think it's somewhat unfair the way that some people are treating the Irvingians as a cult. But I'm not going to say that every Irvingian group is overboard on many things, because I'm sure that there are some that do have some serious problems. But from what I understand, they actually hold a lot of traditional Christian positions that most other churches hold. Similar thing with the Adventists, although the Adventists, I would argue, are a bit more controversial with some of the things that they teach. But um, I'm just saying, if you want to kick them out from being part of the church, as many do, then you'd have to kick out a lot of other people. Um, so I don't think you could reasonably say that Irvingians should be kicked out without kicking out Catholics, for example. Uh, Although I personally am someone who believes in a somewhat narrower communion than Redeemed Zoomer, so in that sense, I probably am someone who takes a more historically uh, unrevised Westminster criticism of the Catholic Church, as opposed to Redeemed Zoomer's revised version of the Westminster that removes some of those criticisms. But don't want to be too controversial here. Anyway, another thing that people don't look at a lot is African initiated churches. Now, there's the Ethiopian African initiated churches. These are broad categories that uh, people who study these denominations have made, which are generally similar to Oriental Orthodox practices because they're based off of the uh, historical churches in Ethiopia. There's another group called Messianic African Initiated Churches, which are, uh, you could say that they're personality cults, and that'd be entirely accurate. Uh, but a lot of criticisms people have about these African initiated churches is that they have some syncretism with traditional beliefs. Now, there's the Zionist African initiated churches, which have historical ties with Pentecostalism, which is why they're in the charismatic movement here. There's also the Aladura Pentecostal churches, which obviously have Pentecostal ties. And one thing that happens I think the Aladura Pentecostal churches historically, I don't know exactly how many churches of that kind today hold this position, but historically they held a position of faith healing in opposition to both traditional African and modern medicine. So that's certainly something that's controversial. Now, some people would call these cults, but for the purpose of making a denominational chart, I'm not going to make that discrimination here, although I am not including non-Trinitarians, or although I don't know exactly about the Trinitarian nature of all of these African initiated churches. I'm just using them as broad categories here. But I am excluding non-Trinitarians for the purposes of this chart, and also many minor denominations that don't really matter. So that is it for this chart and my explanation thereof. I am looking forward to potential responses on this. And once again, I'd like to thank Redeem Zoomer for starting these types of conversations. If we could ever enter into a dialogue, I would be happy to do that, or to enter into a dialogue with other people that like discussing these issues. So anyway, thank you for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time. Goodbye.